And welcome back to World History Until 1500. This is week 11, lecture 2. This is our second to last lecture. And today I'm kind of combining a look at Africa, mostly focusing on Africa and a little bit at the Americas, which we've looked more at the Americas than Africa in this course, so I'm giving Africa a little bit more time today. But these two cultures on the eve of what I'm calling European conquest, or the contact with Europe, which would result eventually in the modern period in the colonization of large chunks of Africa and the Americas. Now, this is a topic that is a part of modern history that you will learn about if you take the next course in this series, Modern World History. But as we are now kind of in the wrap-up phase of our course, we'll begin to kind of dovetail with some of the things that we start out with in the modern world. If we put the rough cutoff, as we have for these two courses, at about 1500, today we'll be playing with that boundary a little bit. We'll talk about some things that happen slightly after 1500, or some things that kind of set up a lot of what we see in the early modern world. And so today is a mini lecture. It's only going to be 20, 25, maybe 30 minutes long, and focusing mostly on Africa, mostly in the 14th to 16th centuries. Although, like I said, as you've read in chapter 15, I will also be talking about the Americas a little bit today, mostly Central and South America, or from Mexico southward. And I do think that in the case of this lecture, it's a good idea to go ahead and read the textbook before the lecture. I would recommend doing it that way, because I will be bouncing off of some of the stuff from the textbook without reiterating everything it says. So knowing what the textbook says in 14 and 15, the reading is listed there on the bottom of the slide, is a good idea before you keep going with this lecture. Okay, and one quick reminder before we get into today's lecture is that I've put a cutoff on late work for this course at the end of the month. So you have about a week and a half to 2 weeks left to get anything that's missing in. So if you have a short response that you haven't done yet, if you didn't get the object paper into me yet, get those done by the end of the month, or I can't guarantee that I will have time to grade them. So if you don't get them into me by the end of the month, they may not count. And I'll remind you again that the final paper for the course does need to be in on time, because grades will be due only a couple days later. So I'm going to be rushing through and grading all of those papers right as they come in, so that I can get the grades out to the registrar. And this is a requirement for all faculty. So there is no extra time at the end of the course. You have to get all the work done on time. And you can look at the syllabus for the specific due date. I believe it's like the 9th or something like that. But go ahead and look at the syllabus for the due date. Okay, so I thought we would start, and I'll get myself out of the way here, with this wonderful object from chapter 14, which really reiterates a lot of what I've been saying and what you've been learning all term about the importance of material culture. So these are, I believe they're called Ife, terracotta, copper, and bronze royal heads, and there are multiples of these that have been found from around 1100 to 1300 that demonstrate African royalty from areas around places like Nigeria. So from 1200, this example of a woman's head here, this is some kind of queen or empress, or I don't know exactly what she would have been called, but this is a leading figure in society who would have been considered quite powerful and royal. And the book here points out the interesting fact that these heads, these figures and images, are very realistic looking. So this is very close to what a real person looks like, right? Perhaps more so than you would see in Christian imagery, especially, and even back in, pre-modern China, pre-modern Japan, for example, or India. The depictions of religious or powerful political figures, these two often go hand in hand, they're one and the same, aren't really all that realistic looking, and these are quite realistic looking. And you could kind of infer all kinds of things about the history of Africa and the history of Ife from these material objects. And I'm going to let you go ahead and think about that, but I do think that these pieces do a good job of answering the second question here, which is why does material culture represent such an important dimension in understanding the African past, right? And we should all know some good answers to that question by now. So I will not answer that for you here, but there are lots of good answers to that question that you should have gotten to by now in our discussions and in the object paper. But, you know, the kind of lack of writing in some places, the presence of writing in others, and who writes what, being one thing that material culture helps to get around is, you know, just one quick answer. But let's go ahead and keep moving here. So chapter 14 gives a really long view of Africa, right? It essentially starts, it goes all the way back to essentially the start of the first millennium and the presence of camels, around a few hundred years CE as a main factor in trade routes and trading. And this chapter also helps to get at some important questions, which I want to talk about here for a minute. The first being, why is Africa less known now, today, to us? For example, to the average American who has learned about history in middle school and high school, elementary school, why is Africa less known, generally speaking, than, say, Europe or the Americas or even Asia? I think it's fair to say that out of all of those, Africa is the one we learn the least about in school as children. You may have a different experience than me or the different experience than everyone else in the class, but in general, I'm speaking very generally here, Africa gets less airtime, you could say, in a history class than other continents or other sets of civilizations. Africa is, more than one civilization, certainly. It's a huge continent, the second largest after Asia. And I wonder what you would think about that. I want you to maybe write in the discussion what your answers would be. But one thing I would want to point out and want you to be thinking about in forming an answer to that question is how the modern world, how the last 500 years of history may have shaped how we perceive Africa and what we learn about Africa as a place. In particular, you could argue, and I'm not necessarily making this argument myself, but other people could argue, or it could be a strong argument, that the colonization of Africa results in a lessening of its status as it is perceived by the quote-unquote West. And as Americans, we are raised in a society that does have a background in Western civilization, right? And so this results in a favoring of Western history over non-Western history. This is also something I deal with as an Asianist, and that is definitely perceptible in our education system even today, that we learn more about the history of Europe and more about the history of America than we do about the rest of the world. A part of this is perfectly natural. If you're from India, you're going to learn probably more Indian history than we are here in America. And you're probably going to learn less American history than we do here in America. A part of this is perfectly normal, perfectly natural. It's to understand the world around you. But part of it is also the result of this kind of long-standing, long-developed political and economic imbalance, in particular with Africa, I think it's fair to say, that we see. And this ties into issues, dark historical issues like slavery, exploitation, colonization, all of which I can, fortunately for me, I guess, leave to the modern history course, because these are mostly modern historical issues that have happened in the last 500 years. But our perception of the past, even before the beginning of colonialism or slavery or any of these other things, is also changed by those things. And so we need to be aware of that as we approach this as a topic in our discussion, and as historians yourselves, you should be aware of some of the cultural biases that are built in over the modern period into our perception of the very old past. So then, That we know less about Africa leads to the second question. Does that mean it was less active? There's less going on? Is that why we know less? That there's just less stuff happening, so there's less to know? There wasn't much change, there wasn't much going on? And of course, the answer to this question is no. There's a lot going on, as chapter 14 will tell you. Africa is before 1500, is a world of many kingdoms, especially on the coastlines that are interacting and changing and conquering one another, gaining knowledge from Europe and the Islamic world in particular. There are both Christian and Islamic kingdoms developing in Africa, which you'll be reading about or hopefully have read about at this point. And meanwhile, in the center of Africa, generally speaking, there are fewer large states and more clan-like or tribal cultures, which do not develop into the size of states. And this is the majority of the centralized population in the middle of the country, or of the continent, which is still quite important, and you'll see this mentioned at the end of the chapter in the wrapping it up section of the chapter, the putting it all together part. And it's important to consider this mass of people who we know less about, in part because they were not part of big states. This doesn't mean their history is not important. It means it is harder to study. Sure. And that's probably one reason why some parts of Africa are less known. Sure. But also that maybe we need to get at them through things like material culture, and things like mytho-history, etc., to understand them better. I think this image, this map, is an excellent indicator of the kind of hustle and bustle that was really the northeastern chunk of Africa in this image, although there's another one on 325 that shows the bulk of the east coast of Africa as particularly active through, the 1400s or so. And I asked the question here, what do you think this map indicates culturally? Now, unfortunately, I can't wait for your answers, so I have to kind of give you mine here. But you can see that the sphere of African trade that is engaging frequently with the Arabian Peninsula is also the sphere that is most influenced by Islam. This is probably no great surprise. And so the bulk of the coastal peoples in this area, Ethiopia not really being coastal, in fact, and being an exception to this, adopts a combination or a largely Islamic and maybe minor African traditional set of spiritual beliefs or religious beliefs. And we start to see this evidenced in things like people's names, which begin to take on Islamic characteristics. As well as in their writings, which are written in Arabic script often. And we see the same thing happening with Ethiopia and other places where Christianity is adopted. And these peoples begin to be engaged and interacting in a much broader cultural world, which has close links to both the Islamic Empire and the Christian world, the two of which are kind of at frequent war or conflict to the north of Africa, and which are also having this kind of cultural balance being struck in Africa itself. And you can see page 322 for a hint on how to read this map. Well, let's go ahead and continue here. This map I took from Wikipedia, actually, which has actually an excellent list of the kingdoms in pre-colonial Africa. And I do not recommend Wikipedia as a source of research, but or of primary research, but you can use it for lists like this to kind of get some initial knowledge. And I think this map is particularly useful in that it shows the kind of mixing, overlapping world of the kingdoms of Africa, pre-colonial Africa. And you can see how many of these, especially in the north to northeastern coast and in the west, sub-Saharan Africa in the west or northwest, are overlapping with one another. and therefore interacting and, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively, conquering and interacting with one another. And this is actually a big part of why pre-colonial Africa is kind of hard to study, especially for someone like me who's not an expert. I'm an Asianist, so Africa is out of my field of expertise, both in terms of my personal life, as someone raised in this American Western favored educational system and knowledgeable about Asia. Africa is certainly a gap in my knowledge as a world historian where I should learn more. But it's also hard to study just because there is so much happening and so much of it is overlapping. So if you're studying one of these empires, or kingdoms, I should say, we call them kingdoms, not empires, and maybe I'll talk about that later, you're going to find in places like, for example, Geno, which I mentioned earlier in the term, multiple kingdoms kind of on top of each other in the sediment of these physical places. So an archaeologist will find, for example, like that, I showed you a picture of Geno, where you'll find 3 or 4 different kingdoms buried on top of each other. And so to understand the history, you have to be quite an expert in this kind of change over time that various regions experience. Henry Louis Gates Jr., who's a professor at Harvard University, made a very good set of documentaries. I guess you'd call them, I think it's a 6-part miniseries that was on PBS. And I would really recommend, it's called Africa's Great Civilizations. I would really recommend watching this video at least, which introduces it. And I'm not going to show it because of copyright. But it's a very good series for understanding some of Africa's history in depth, because it's a 6-part miniseries. It's about 6 hours long in total. So if you're interested in this stuff, I would really recommend that, because it's a Harvard professor giving a kind of introductory set of lessons through video, a very interactive, engaging set of videos about the history of Africa. And as I've already said, much of our image of Africa is a modern construct, so it's really built from the 16th century onward. And Africa was, this is a really important point that Henry Louis Gates Jr. makes in his, in this video, in fact, and in his documentary, is that Africa was much better known to pre-modern Europe and Asia than it is to us today. It was much more integrated. I mean, China and Zheng He and other traders were making it to certainly the east coast of Africa for several hundred years before 1500. Europe, obviously, the cradle of civilization is located partly in Africa, and human origins come from Africa, and so communication with and connection to Africa had essentially existed for all of human history. And the disconnect that the modern world sees is really this product of modernist ideology of what is modern and quote unquote modern, and what is enlightened, quote unquote enlightened, or civilized, quote unquote. And so these are problems for the modern historian to kind of unpack how we perceive Africa today, despite the fact that historically Africa was very well connected with the rest of the world. We see in this chapter, chapter 14, it's very obvious that there's a huge amount of cultural variety across this vast continent. So not only in terms of things like religion and language, but also in terms of the way states are formed, in their politics, in the social lives of people, the way they live. We see Christian kingdoms, Islamic kingdoms, and kingdoms that are based on native African beliefs, especially in Central Africa, away from the coast. And we see great works, major cities, and architectural marvels. And here I'm going to link you directly to this Greatest Civilizations page. If you want some really quick videos, these are a few really good ones. I think there's, 5 of them, I guess. And the one I'm going to talk about just for a second here is the great city of Zimbabwe, which you can watch a wonderful video of. I've just taken a chunk of this video for this picture here. But the point is that Africa is not a static or stagnant or backwater as it's sometimes portrayed today. It is a vibrant place with lots of people interacting with each other, changing over time. And this great city of Great Zimbabwe represents this culminating urban center. It has these huge walls, these pretty dramatic kind of structures within it, compartmentalized. And the walls are apparently there not so much for defense as much as for prestige. These are built like a European manor might be built, where it's not like a castle that's built for defense. It's built for prestige and to kind of show off your power and wealth. And so if you want to learn about the great city of Zimbabwe, it's mentioned in our book, and then we have a wonderful little video here that you can watch that is linked here. We have explorers before Columbus. This is kind of linking to what I'm going to talk about just a little bit next time, but we've learned about Zheng He and please forgive my French, but pardon my French, Lance aux Meadows and Leif Erikson, the Viking settlement in what is now part of Canada, as well as the Polynesian expansion, much, much earlier, expansion across the Pacific by the Polynesians, the Maori, etc., Pacific Island peoples. And Africa also had its early oceanic explorers. The most famous, known as Abu Bakr II, or Mansa Abu Bakari II, was a ruler, a king, I suppose you would say, who ruled the Mali Empire. And the Mali is kind of northwest Africa. It's a landlocked country today. And this emperor and his son, or king and his son, are well known for their effort to expand their kingdom to the Atlantic coastline. And the father here, Abu Bakr II, or Abu Bakr II, eventually decided to give up his kingship, to say, I am done ruling the country, I'm done ruling the kingdom, and I'm going to give power to my son so that I can go explore the oceans. This is really unusual. This is kind of unprecedented that a ruler, instead of sending out someone like Christopher Columbus or Zheng He, who is, an esteemed, capable navigator, but not the ruler of the country, they go themselves. And so this man goes himself, and he's known almost exclusively through the records of one Islamic scholar, as well as oral histories about him. But we do have a bit of knowledge about him. You can read a news article from about 20 years ago here. Although kind of he's a semi-legendary person. He lived, he did this thing, but the specifics of his voyages are little known. And you'll have to kind of study it on your own if you're interested. And then his son, Mansa Musa, a fairly well-known figure, is the richest person in history if you correct for economic change over time, right? He didn't have any US dollars, obviously, so it's difficult to compare the wealth of people over time, but the kind of supposition of economic historians who make this kind of claim is that if you were to correct for the modern world, if you were to correct for inflation and translate his wealth into the modern world, he would be the richest person in history. And he's the son of this oceanic explorer who continued to expand the borders of his kingdom to try to take advantage of Atlantic trade. So kind of a chip off the old block here. Like his father, he had a keen interest in using the ocean, the Atlantic Ocean in this case, to gain wealth and to gain prestige and power for his kingdom. He was a devout Islamic faithful person who made journeys to Mecca, and these are well known and recorded as having been, gigantic enterprises, the move of people to Mecca, and this is one image, a reproduction of what that is supposed to have looked like. But at the same time, neither he nor his father nor the others in his line imposed Islam as a state religion. It was merely something that a lot of people followed in their state. So this is a state that is the Mali state that is probably a mix of African native beliefs, native, ancestor worship, spirit worship, earth worship, alongside Islam as two kind of sets of beliefs that were considered compatible. But a fascinating figure, and someone who also might kind of shift your perception of the pre-modern world of Africa, which, as this indicates, was quite vibrant, quite wealthy, and quite active on the world stage in reality. So what went wrong? Why did Africa not take over the world, for example? Just as we could ask, why did China not take over the world? Why was it that Europe was the colonizing force that we see in modern history that you learn about in the next course in this series? There are a couple of common claims or common arguments, and you could make your own arguments in the discussion board if you want, but I want to point out these two, and I'm not necessarily arguing for these two, but I'm going to kind of show you the two sides here. One argument is environmental change and desertification. Obviously, if we look back to the very first lecture, I believe, of the course, or possibly the second one, back when we were in person, I told you about how the Sahara Desert was once a lush green place that people traveled on and moved across without difficulty, that was a kind of heart of cross-African and cross cradle of civilization, trade, and movement. But over time, Africa in the north in particular has dried out and become less hospitable, less habitable, and less resource rich. Africa remains a place that is one of, if not the most affected places by climate change today. Probably more people in the world are directly threatened to be, kind of unable to live where they live currently in Africa than anywhere else due to the global rise in temperatures, which they're feeling in particular there. And so the question then is, did the desertification of the formerly green belt of northern Africa have a continuous negative impact on development there? Is that a reason for the failure of Africa to kind of, survive European colonization? And you can have your opinions on that. I think environmental change is probably a factor. It's obviously a factor in African history, but to me, it does not explain away everything, right? So I think even as an environmental historian myself, I think it does not have persuasive power to say the reason that Africa and African kingdoms did not survive was environmental change. There's probably more to it than that. How about segmentation? This is an argument that goes alongside that one and is perhaps to me slightly more convincing if you look at it together with environmental change. But the other argument you see is if you look back at that earlier map, we see a lot of segmentation across Africa, right? There aren't kingdoms like the Mongol Empire that end up overtaking all of the continent, not even close, in fact. They're all only a small percentage of the total of Africa. And that could result in maybe a broad weakness to the impositions of larger empires. So if we call these groups of people in Africa either kingdoms or something smaller than a kingdom, which is what they are commonly called, do these bigger Asian and European empires, or, for example, the Islamic Empire, the Chinese Empire, the Hindu Buddhist Empire, and the Christian, if we want to call it empire, the Christian world, have advantages because of their physical size? Perhaps, but that might not explain everything itself as well. So the argument you'll generally hear for segmentation as a reason for Africa's difficulty in quote-unquote keeping up is that large-scale conquests of Asia and Europe, like the Pax Mongolica, if we call it a Mongol peace, and that's a question I've already posed to you, is that they speed up political and technological change. So when you get a whole lot of people under one umbrella, one political and economic umbrella, it causes evolution. in terms of political and economic change. It causes rapid shifts. And maybe that was not as much the case in Africa. But then we have to think about if there is a counterpoint to this argument. So does this argument reflect on how we would view America as well then? Because America and Africa share similar fates, the Americas and Africa, when it comes to European colonization. And in fact, Asia does to a lesser degree as well. So the colonization of the wider world includes places outside of Africa where there are big empires, where there are big conflicts that do lead to rapid evolutions. And so the counterpoint to this argument, and I'm not going to talk about it for long, is the Americas, in my opinion. And this is just my opinion now. But we've discussed the peoples of Central and South America at some length. We've talked about the Mayans. We've talked about the kind of Incans and pre-Incans. Less about the Native Americans, at least not for a while now, of North America, Native North Americans, I should say. But there are big empires in Central America and South America around the same time, around the 14th, 15th, 16th century, the Mayas, the Incas, and the Aztecs, which are much bigger in terms of their physical size than most of these African kingdoms. I think pretty much all of them, in fact, and which have these broader physical scopes and which kind of conglomerate large groups of otherwise different peoples in ways that are similar to what we see in the Islamic Empire or the Chinese empires or the Mongol Empire, for example, than what we see in Africa. We don't see this in Africa. And yet the fates are the same. So there may be some other things to explain here. Here's an image of the Incan Empire, which is really this vast network. It is largely coastal and mountainous coastal, but this is a huge, long stretch of territory that encompasses people that previously had quite separate civilizations or societies or cultures. And we see evidence of substantial collaboration and cooperation, which most of it, begins with warfare and then turns into collaboration over time. But for example, the road system in the Incan civilization. It's this vast network of roads and bridges, which are made from rope, which need to be maintained and built up. The bridges themselves need to be built and rebuilt every couple of years, in some cases more often than that. And thus, it is not a single central power that is controlling and mandating all of this. There is a local impetus to cooperate and collaborate and create this large empire. It is beneficial to people both in and out of the center, for example, at a place like Cuzco. And yet, despite this fact, we do see a large-scale European conquest of North, Central, and South America in the next few hundred years. This is all part of what would be in a modern history course. And so I leave you kind of today in accounting for similarities and differences, even without contact, and how we look back on Africa and the Americas, kind of the non-Western colonized worlds, and indeed also in part of Asia, as places that experienced similar fates, similar histories, despite being quite different in their own rights. And the book on page 354 has this excellent passage that talks about some of the similarities that we see in the empires of the Americas, especially Central and South America, with those that we see in Eurasia and Africa. We see these big empires forming, even though there's no real contact between Eurasia and Africa and the Americas until after these empires are, coming into conflict with one another. So I leave the question to you. How do we parse the histories of the Americas and Africa before colonialism, before colonization, given the differences between Africa and the Americas and the similarity that we see between Africa and the Americas? And how do we also understand our own view, in particular of Africa today, in light of the past 500 years? And hopefully this is something that will be useful for you to talk about in discussion. I think it's an interesting topic, but it's really a question for modern history, right? So this is the first of 2 wrap-up lectures for the course, and I'm going to leave it there. Next time we'll be talking about the Renaissance, a little bit more about oceanic explorers, not much because I talked about it today a bit, and a little bit more about colonialism. That will also be another kind of shorter lecture, probably a half hour or so. We'll look at some Renaissance art, and we'll do a reading from chapters 18 and 17. This weekend, by the 24th, you should respond to the Mongols and Silk Road discussion, and then I'll have a short response for you on Africa before European colonization. Might also be a question in there about the Americas too, as you know, you're reading both of these things. That short response will be mostly built on the readings, a little bit on this lecture too. Okay, so remember, you need to finish all of your late work or missing work by the end of the month, and you should be up and running on your paper, your source analysis paper, which is due at the end of the term. Okay, I hope this has been helpful. I really enjoyed getting to learn more about Africa for today's lecture. It was a learning experience for me. And these readings are quite fascinating. I think the textbook is particularly strong here, at least for me. So I hope it was useful, and I will see you next time.